The sensational trial in America that's finally found Panama's General Manuel Noriega guilty of cocaine smuggling on a massive scale. It took a small war to get him before a jury in Miami, but President Bush is obviously delighted at the results.
And I hope it sends a lesson to drug lords here and around the world that they'll pay a price if they continue to poison the lives of our kids in this country or anywhere else.
That's how an elated president saw today's historic verdict, but others saw it differently.
Unless leaders of foreign governments are willing to kneel once a day and face Washington and give praise to George Bush, they too may be in the same posture as General Noriega.
A bitter defense attorney, Frank Rubino.
This, in our opinion, is the modern-day version of the Crusades, as the United States will now trample across the entire world, imposing its will upon so-called independent sovereign nations.
The former Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega was finally nabbed by a persistent US government. He was today found guilty on 8 of 10 drug and racketeering charges, and it was an elated prosecution.
It was all worth it. They did one heck of a job, and we're proud of what we did and what the agents did most of all.
Noriega's trip to the courts began in 1988 when the military strongman was indicted by a US grand jury for protecting the powerful Colombian Medellin cocaine cartel. But the general, who accepted bribes estimated at $35 million, refused to budge. His violent reign continued and his loyal followers remained. But US patience was beginning to run out. In May 1989, Noriega annulled the election he'd lost, and then his troops battered the opposition candidate. 7 months later, George Bush announced Operation Just Cause.
Many attempts have been made to resolve this crisis through diplomacy and negotiations. All were rejected by the dictator of Panama, General Manuel Noriega, an indicted drug trafficker.
23,000 US troops invaded Panama and in a brief war left a ruined city without their prize. The former CIA agent and go-between for the US and Cuban dictator Fidel Castro had fled to the Vatican embassy, but days later he surrendered.
The United States is committed to providing General Noriega a fair trial. Nevertheless, his apprehension and return to the United States should send a clear signal that the United States is serious in its determination that those charged with promoting the distribution of drugs cannot escape the scrutiny of justice.
The 6-month trial paraded before it several Noriega aides. After $10 million, Noriega's freedom had ended. He'll be sentenced in July and faces up to 120 years in prison. That grueling trial was spearheaded by prosecutor Miles Malman, who spoke to us shortly after the verdict. Mr. Malman, welcome. Were you concerned?
Thank you.
Were you concerned at any stage that Mr. Noriega may in fact get off, given that the jury was taking so long to bring in a guilty verdict?
Well, I've been in this business a while, and when you have a 7-month trial, this is really not a long time. When that first note came out and there appeared to be a deadlock, I guess I was the optimist of the bunch, because I felt that this very often happens in a long deliberation where they get a little bumpy and lumpy in the beginning as far as the deliberative process. But when the judge sent them back in and it was quiet all day yesterday, I felt quite confident we would get a verdict.
What do you think was the problem in the jury's mind as far as convicting Noriega goes?
Well, I really don't think there was any problem. They came back in quick time, about 4 days of deliberation, which is pretty quick. So, we were reading a case the other day where the jury took 8 weeks to deliberate, and you know, 4 days is not really a long time. So I really don't know what was going on in the jury room, but I don't really perceive there was any major problems.
Do you see the irony in the fact that Noriega was for years reputedly an ally of the US in the fight against drugs, and here he is now being locked up, looks like being locked up for the rest of his life for drug trafficking?
Well, in that way, you could call it ironical, but when you look at what the facts and the evidence showed, which was that he was really nothing more than a corrupt or crooked cop, a rotten cop, but just a dishonest law enforcement person I think that without that ability to have that relationship with American law enforcement, he would have never been in such a good position to commit all these crimes.
What was his reaction when the jury returned its verdict?
I really didn't look over at him too much, but I've heard from some people that he was devastated.
And his family, I believe his family, some members of his family were in the courtroom.
Well, we haven't seen his wife since the shoplifting incident. I don't know if you folks in down under heard about that, but Mrs. Noriega was arrested for shoplifting buttons at a posh department store here. And ever since that incident, she hasn't been around, but his daughters have been attending the trial, and I did not see their reaction.
Mr. Melman, just finally, how will Noriega do his time?
Well, that'll be totally up to the Bureau of Prisons, and they will have to assess and evaluate his risk of security, his risk of mingling with the other prisoners, what level institution they'll want to put him in, and the rest. That is totally an independent decision made by our department or bureau that governs the prison system in the United States.
Miles Melman. Now, when it comes to getting pregnant, maybe nature knows best after all. That's after the break.